On the morning of December 21st, 1944, Brigadier General John Hamilton Hines stood at his artillery command post near Elsenborn Ridge in Belgium, coordinating fire missions that would determine whether the northern shoulder of the German offensive would break through American lines or shatter against concentrated firepower. Hines commanded the artillery of the 2nd Infantry Division. He was 46 years old, a West Point graduate with 26 years of service, and he understood artillery better than most officers in the European theatre. The Germans had launched their massive Ardennes offensive 5 days earlier. Over 200,000 German troops, 1,000 tanks, and hundreds of artillery pieces were driving west toward the Meuse River. The 6th SS Panzer Army under Joseph Dietrich had been assigned to capture the Elsenborn Ridge, the high ground that controlled the road network north of the German penetration. If the Germans took Elsenborn Ridge, they would have clear access to Liège, the massive American supply depot 20 miles northwest. They would threaten First Army headquarters. They would split the Allied front and possibly reach Antwerp. The entire northern flank of the Allied advance into Germany depended on holding that ridge, and the ridge would be held or lost based on how effectively American artillery could respond to German attacks. By December 21st, Hines had assembled the greatest concentration of artillery firepower in American military history. 348 guns from the 1st, 2nd, 9th, and 99th Divisions, plus heavier 5th Corps artillery, were positioned on and behind Elsenborn Ridge. 16 battalions of 105mm and 155mm howitzers. 6 battalions of corps-level artillery. Every gun registered on likely German approaches. Every battery connected by telephone and radio to forward observers with the infantry regiments fighting in the twin villages of Krinkelt and Rocherath below the ridge. But assembling guns was only half the challenge. The other half was coordinating their fire. Traditional artillery doctrine in December 1944 called for batteries to engage targets sequentially. One battery fires, observers adjust, another battery fires, adjust again. This method had worked since the First World War, but it gave the enemy time to see the first shells land, time to scatter, time to take cover, time to survive. German infantry had learned to disperse from formations in under 15 seconds once they heard incoming rounds. By the time a second battery fired, most targets had moved. The problem was calculating firing data fast enough to achieve simultaneous fire from multiple batteries. Traditional fire direction centers used tabular firing tables. 76 pages of dense numerical data showing elevations, charges, and fuse settings for every possible range and condition. Finding correct data required officers trained in advanced mathematics, cross-referencing pages, interpolating between values, calculating corrections for meteorological conditions. The process took 3 to 5 minutes per battery. In combat, 3 minutes meant the difference between catching enemy forces in the open and hitting empty ground. This problem had been recognized before the war, but solving it required someone who understood both the mathematics of ballistics and the practical frustrations of field artillery operations. That person turned out to be a captain in the National Guard named Abbot Harrington Burns. Burns was an unusual officer. He had graduated from West Point but resigned his commission to work in civilian construction. When the National Guard activated him in 1940, he was assigned to field artillery despite having spent years in cavalry. The assignment was supposed to be temporary preparation before deployment, but Burns discovered he hated cavalry duties and requested transfer to artillery. His superiors approved the transfer, perhaps relieved to move an officer who openly stated he detested horses. In mid-November 1940, Burns arrived at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, for assignment to a Fire Direction Center training team. Fort Sill was and remains the home of the United States Army Field Artillery School. Every artillery officer trained there. The base covered nearly 94,000 acres of Oklahoma prairie, with ranges for testing every type of artillery piece in the American inventory. In November 1940, Fort Sill was expanding rapidly as the Army prepared for possible war. New barracks were under construction. Training cycles had accelerated. Officers rotated through abbreviated courses to get them ready for deployment. Burns was scheduled to complete his Fire Direction Center training and then leave for Arizona, where a construction job with a telephone company was waiting. He had only weeks left in his military service. He planned to finish his obligation and return to civilian life. But the Fire Direction Center assignment changed everything. Burns's first exposure to tabular firing tables confirmed what he had suspected. The system was painfully slow. Fire Direction Centers used a massive book, technically called a firing table, that contained 76 pages of dense numerical data for each type of artillery piece and ammunition combination. Each page showed elevations, charges, and fuse settings for different ranges. But the pages were organized in increments, typically every 50 or 100 meters. If your target was at an odd range, you had to interpolate between values. That required additional calculations. The process for a single fire mission worked like this. Forward observer calls target coordinates. Fire Direction Center plots the target position and calculates range and deflection from the battery to the target. Officer opens the firing table book to the page covering that range, searches the page for the elevation corresponding to that range and the charge being used. If the range falls between tabulated values, calculates the interpolated elevation, looks up drift correction on another page, looks up fuse setting on yet another page, applies corrections for meteorological conditions, which requires checking a separate metadata card showing current temperature, pressure, and wind, calculates corrections for any difference in altitude between the gun and target. Finally, after 3 to 5 minutes of searching and calculating, transmits the firing data to the battery. For a battery of 6 guns firing as a unit, this was acceptable, though slow, but for coordinating multiple batteries, it was impossible. By the time the second battery calculated their data, the tactical situation had changed. German infantry had dispersed. Armor had moved. The target was gone. Burns recognized that the problem wasn't the mathematics. The ballistics calculations were sound. The firing tables contained accurate data derived from extensive testing. The problem was accessing that data quickly. Looking up values in tables was inherently slow. No amount of training could make an officer search 76 pages faster than physically possible. Burns thought about the problem for several days. He had engineering training from West Point and practical experience from construction work. He understood that when you had a recurring calculation that always followed the same pattern, you could design a mechanical device to do it faster than manual methods. Slide rules, which every engineer used, were exactly that. Mechanical computers that performed multiplication and division by sliding logarithmic scales past each other. Could a slide rule be adapted for artillery calculations? The standard slide rule used logarithmic scales, which worked for multiplication and division, but not for the specific calculations artillery required. But the principle was sound. If you could design scales that represented the relationships in the firing tables, you could read answers directly instead of searching through pages. One evening in late November 1940, Burns stayed late at the Fort Sill training facility. The classrooms were empty. Other officers had gone to the officers' club or retired to their quarters. Burns sat at a desk with a stack of firing tables, graph paper, a ruler, and a pencil. He started sketching ideas for a custom slide rule specifically designed for artillery. He worked for about 2 hours that first evening. The breakthrough came when he realized he didn't need to represent all the data in the firing tables. He only needed to represent the relationships between range, elevation, and charge. If he created a linear scale for range and another scale for elevation, positioned so they aligned correctly, he could set the cursor to a range and directly read the corresponding elevation. No table searching required. The next evening, Burns returned to the empty classroom and continued working. He refined the scale relationships. He added additional scales for fuse settings and drift corrections. He experimented with different layouts to see which would be easiest to read. By the end of the second evening, he had a workable design sketched on graph paper, a wooden base about 10 inches long, multiple scales printed on the base, a clear plastic cursor that slid along the base with a hairline engraved across it for precise reading. Burns constructed a prototype using materials from the Fort Sill training facility, a strip of wood from a crate, paper scales carefully drawn and glued to the wood, a piece of clear acetate for the cursor, with a line scratched across it using a straight edge. The result looked crude, but it worked. Burns tested it against problems from the firing tables. Set the cursor to a range, read the elevation, check against the table value. Perfect match. And it took about 20 seconds instead of 3 minutes. Burns showed his prototype to other officers in the Fire Direction Center course. Most were polite but uninterested. They had been trained on tabular methods. They were comfortable with the tables. They saw no reason to learn something new, especially something that looked like a homemade contraption built from scrap materials. A few officers were actively hostile, suggesting that Burns was wasting time on gimmicks instead of learning proper procedures. But one officer saw the potential immediately. Major George V. Kaiser, an instructor at Fort Sill, examined Burns's prototype carefully. Kaiser was an experienced artillery officer who had been teaching fire direction for over a year. He had seen hundreds of students struggle with the tabular method. He understood exactly how much time officers wasted searching through pages. When Burns demonstrated the slide rule, Kaiser recognized that it could revolutionize artillery operations. Kaiser told Burns to forget about the telephone job in Arizona. This device was too important. They needed to refine it, test it thoroughly, and get it adopted by the Army. Burns was skeptical. He had already been frustrated by Army bureaucracy. He could see the red tape that would be involved in getting a new device approved. But Kaiser was persistent. He had the rank and position to advocate within the Field Artillery School. He convinced Burns to stay at Fort Sill and work on developing the graphical firing table into a production device. Most officers at Fort Sill were unimpressed. They had been trained on tabular methods and saw no reason to change. But one officer recognized the potential. Major George V. Kaiser saw what Burns's device could do. It could reduce calculation time from 3 to 5 minutes down to under 30 seconds. That meant fire direction centers could coordinate multiple batteries to fire simultaneously. That meant time-on-target missions where shells from batteries at different distances all arrived on target at the same instant. Burns and Kaiser spent the next 3 months refining what they called the graphical firing table. They smoothed out the design problems. They adapted it to compute ranges for any powder charge and any weapon system. They tested it extensively at Fort Sill. Artillery officers who learned to use it could calculate firing data more than 20 times faster than traditional methods. Enlisted men with basic arithmetic could do calculations that previously required officers with engineering degrees. Getting the device officially adopted by the Army was slower work. The Field Artillery School at Fort Sill recognized its value and began using it in training immediately, but the War Department moved cautiously. Burns eventually became discouraged. Above his desk at Fort Sill, he pinned a bunch of red tape to remind himself of bureaucratic resistance and slouched back to contemplate horses again. But Kaiser kept pushing. He rushed in where colonels feared to tread, advocating for the graphical firing table at every opportunity. Eventually, he sold the War Department on its value. By early 1942, the Field Artillery School was producing graphical firing tables and teaching their use to artillery officers heading to combat theaters. By mid-1944, thousands of the devices had been manufactured and distributed to artillery units in Europe and the Pacific. The graphical firing table was elegant in its simplicity, a 10-inch wooden ruler with scales printed on both sides. Different scales for different ammunition types, different charges, different weapons. The cursor slid along the ruler, and its engraved hairline let you read exact values from the scales. Drift correction, elevation, fuse setting, range, all the data needed for a fire mission, readable in seconds instead of minutes. Fire Direction Center crews could calculate data for an entire battery in the time it previously took to look up one page in the tabular tables. But the device was only as effective as the doctrine that employed it. Having one battery calculate data quickly meant nothing if other batteries still used slow methods. The real innovation came from combining the graphical firing table with a technique called time on target. Time on target meant coordinating multiple batteries so that all shells arrived simultaneously, regardless of how far each battery was from the target. Batteries closer to the target fired later. Batteries farther away fired first. Each battery calculated their own flight time and adjusted their firing time, so all rounds impacted within a 3-second window. The effect was devastating. Instead of shells arriving in sequence over several minutes, giving the enemy time to disperse, all shells arrived at once. No warning, no time to take cover. Maximum casualties inflicted in the first seconds of the barrage when troops were still in the open. The technique had been developed theoretically before the war, but it required calculation speed that only the graphical firing table could provide. Traditional methods were too slow to coordinate batteries precisely enough for true simultaneous impact. The importance of this cannot be overstated. Artillery had been the primary killer in modern warfare since the First World War. More casualties came from artillery than from small arms, machine guns, or tanks combined. But artillery effectiveness depended on catching enemy forces in vulnerable positions. Troops in fortified positions or dispersed in cover had much higher survival rates than troops caught in the open. The key was hitting targets before they could react to incoming fire. Traditional sequential artillery fire gave defenders that reaction time. When the first shells landed, everyone dove for cover. Subsequent salvos hit empty ground or struck targets already protected. Casualties occurred, but at much lower rates than if all shells arrived simultaneously. Every military knew this. Doctrine emphasized concentrating fire and achieving surprise. But actually delivering truly simultaneous fire from multiple batteries required coordination that was mathematically impractical with tabular firing methods. The graphical firing table solved that mathematical bottleneck. Batteries could calculate their data fast enough to coordinate precise firing times. Fire direction centers could determine exactly when each battery needed to fire, so that shells with different flight times all arrived together. This required knowing the exact flight time for each battery's distance to the target, then working backward to calculate firing times. With tabular methods, that calculation took too long to be practical during combat. With graphical firing tables, it could be done in under a minute for multiple batteries. By December 1944, many American artillery units in Europe had graphical firing tables, though adoption varied. Some units used them routinely and had developed proficiency in time-on-target techniques. Other units preferred traditional methods, either from conservatism or because their officers had been trained before the graphical firing table was widely available. The device was equipment, not doctrine. Units could choose whether to use it. That changed at Elsenborn Ridge, where the concentration of artillery made the advantages undeniable. On December 16th, when the German offensive began, American forces were caught by surprise. Intelligence had missed the German build-up completely. Over 200,000 German troops, 1,000 tanks, and hundreds of artillery pieces had assembled in the Eifel Mountains without American reconnaissance detecting the concentration. The weather had been overcast for weeks, grounding Allied aircraft that normally provided surveillance. German radio discipline had been excellent. Movements occurred at night. The surprise was nearly complete. The inexperienced 99th Infantry Division held the line in front of the Elsenborn Ridge. They were green troops, arrived in theatre only in November, deployed to what was considered a quiet sector where they could acclimate to combat conditions gradually. The division was stretched thin across a 22-mile front, much longer than doctrinal guidance recommended. All 3 regiments were on the line with no reserves, but American commanders considered this acceptable because the Ardennes sector was assessed as low threat, rugged terrain, poor road network, unsuitable for major German offensive operations. That assessment was catastrophically wrong. Behind the 99th Division, the veteran 2nd Infantry Division was preparing for limited offensive operations near Wallerscheid. The 2nd Division, known as Indian Heads from their distinctive shoulder patch, was battle-hardened from months of combat in the Hurtgen forest. They had suffered heavy casualties and were being rotated to the Ardennes for what was supposed to be a recovery period. Instead, they would fight one of the most critical defensive battles of the war. The German assault began precisely at 05:30 on December 16th. German artillery opened fire simultaneously across a 50-mile front. In the northern sector, facing the 99th Division, over 1,000 German guns participated in the initial bombardment. Heavy artillery, Nebelwerfer multiple rocket launchers, and mobile artillery pounded American positions for 90 minutes. The Germans also used searchlights pointed at cloud cover to create artificial moonlight, improving visibility for their gunners. The effect was terrifying, even though casualties were relatively light. American soldiers had prepared well, digging deep foxholes covered with logs. Most survived the barrage physically unscathed, but psychologically shaken by the intensity. At 0700 hours, German infantry assaults began across the sector. The 12th Volksgrenadier Division and elements of the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, advanced toward objectives in the Loschim Gap and near the twin villages of Krinkelt and Rocherath. The 1st SS Panzer Division, under SS Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Peiper, pushed through the southern part of the sector toward Malmedy and the Meuse River beyond. The German plan required rapid penetration, seize the twin villages on the first day, capture Elsenborn Ridge on the second day, reach the Meuse River by the third or fourth day, Antwerp within a week. These timelines were critical because the Germans had limited fuel supplies and the weather was forecast to improve, which would bring Allied air power back into the battle. The 99th Division fought far better than anyone, including themselves, expected. Green troops with minimal combat experience held positions under overwhelming assault. Small unit leaders made good tactical decisions. Artillery support was responsive despite communication problems from the initial bombardment. The division inflicted much heavier casualties on attacking Germans than they suffered themselves. German assault units, which had been briefed to expect quick penetration, found themselves bogged down in protracted fighting against defenders who refused to break. One of the most remarkable actions occurred at Lanzerath Ridge on the first day. An intelligence and reconnaissance platoon from the 99th Division, just 18 men led by Lieutenant Lyle Buch, held a position that was hit by an entire German parachute regiment, approximately 500 men. The 18 Americans fought from prepared positions on the ridge, using interlocking fields of fire and precise marksmanship to repel repeated German assaults. They held for over 12 hours, delaying the advance of Kampfgruppe Peiper, the spearhead of the 1st SS Panzer Division. This delay of almost 20 hours threw off the entire German offensive timetable in the northern sector. By the time German paratroopers finally flanked and captured Buch's position at dusk, valuable time had been lost. American reinforcements were already moving toward threatened positions. But despite heroic actions by small units, the 99th Division couldn't hold indefinitely against overwhelming German strength. By December 17th, German pressure was collapsing portions of the American line. The 2nd Division, which had been preparing offensive operations, received emergency orders to reverse course and support the 99th Division's withdrawal to Elsenborn Ridge. Major General Walter M. Robertson commanded the 2nd Infantry Division. He was an experienced, no-nonsense officer who understood defensive warfare. On December 17th, Robertson made a crucial decision. Instead of trying to hold the twin villages indefinitely, he would use them as a fighting withdrawal position. The 99th Division would pull back through Krinkelt and Rocherath. The 2nd Division would hold the villages long enough for the withdrawal to complete, then pull back to prepared positions on Elsenborn Ridge. The ridge itself, with its commanding terrain and concentrated artillery, would be the main line of resistance. The fighting in Krinkelt and Rocherath over the next 3 days was some of the most brutal of the war, house-to-house combat. American infantry isolated in individual buildings, surrounded by German armor, panzer tanks firing at point-blank range into basements where GIs were sheltering, American bazookas and tank destroyers stalking German armor through rubble-filled streets. Both sides took heavy casualties. Buildings burned. Civilians who hadn't evacuated huddled in cellars, but the withdrawal worked. By December 19th, most American forces had pulled back to Elsenborn Ridge. The Germans controlled the twin villages, but at enormous cost. The 12th SS Panzer, Division Hitlerjugend, and supporting Volksgrenadier divisions had been bled white. They had taken 3 days to advance 2 miles. They had lost dozens of tanks and hundreds of infantry, and now they faced the most formidable defensive position in the Ardennes, Elsenborn Ridge, held by 3 American divisions, supported by the greatest concentration of artillery ever assembled by the United States Army. Brigadier General Hines had been preparing for this moment. As division artillery commander for the 2nd Infantry Division, he had positioned his guns carefully. He had registered targets on every likely approach route. He had established communication networks with forward observers. He had coordinated with artillery battalions from other divisions. By December 20th, Hines had operational control of not just his own division's artillery, but guns from the 1st, 9th, and 99th Divisions, plus corps-level heavy artillery, 23 battalions, 340, 8 guns, all coordinated through his command post, and every fire direction center under Hines's command had graphical firing tables. Every artillery officer knew how to use them. Every battery could calculate firing data in under 30 seconds. For the first time in the war, American artillery had both the firepower and the coordination capability to execute true time-on-target missions on a massive scale. On December 19th, Hines demonstrated what concentrated artillery could do. German forces made 3 separate attacks on the 99th Division's positions. All 3 attacks were repulsed by artillery fire. Hines directed fire missions that dropped thousands of rounds on German assembly areas, catching them before they could fully deploy. One fire mission against the twin villages delivered 5,760 rounds in 20 minutes. German prisoners later reported that the artillery bombardment was unlike anything they had experienced. Shells arrived with no warning. Multiple batteries firing simultaneously. No time to take cover between impacts. On December 21st, the 12th SS Panzer Division made another major effort. The 25th Panzer Grenadier Regiment attacked American positions at Dom Budgenbach, south of the main ridge. The attack was supported by tanks from the 12th SS Panzer Regiment. German forces advanced in strength, expecting to overwhelm the isolated American defenders. They advanced into a kill zone that Hines had carefully prepared. Forward observers with the 26th Infantry Regiment of the 1st Infantry Division called for artillery support. Multiple fire direction centers calculated firing data simultaneously using graphical firing tables. Batteries at different distances adjusted their firing times to achieve time-on-target impact. German forces were caught in the open. Hundreds of artillery shells arrived within seconds of each other. High explosive rounds, time fuse rounds set to detonate 15 yards above the ground, spraying shrapnel across wide areas. White phosphorus rounds creating smoke and fire. The barrage was overwhelming. German infantry took massive casualties. Tanks were damaged by near misses. The attack collapsed before it could reach American lines. American infantry reported that the entire German formation simply disintegrated under artillery fire. The Germans tried again later that day. Same result. Artillery crushed the attack before German forces could close with American defenders. German officers who survived reported that they had never experienced such rapid, accurate, devastating artillery fire. Traditional German doctrine said to disperse after the first rounds landed. But there were no first rounds. All rounds landed simultaneously. By the time German soldiers realized they were under fire, they were already casualties. On December 22nd, Hines directed an even larger fire mission. German forces were massing for another attack. Forward observers identified the assembly area. Hines coordinated fire from multiple divisions, batteries from the 1st, 2nd, 9th, and 99th Divisions, plus corps artillery. Time-on-target strike calculated to deliver maximum effect. American artillery fired 10,000 rounds that day. Much of it concentrated in coordinated time-on-target missions. The effect was devastating. German attacks were broken up before they could develop. infantry caught in the open, armor forced to withdraw without supporting infantry, headquarters units hit while planning operations, supply columns destroyed on approach routes. The Germans had never experienced anything like American artillery at Elsenborn. Wehrmacht and SS veterans who had fought on the Eastern Front said Russian artillery was heavier in total volume, with massed batteries firing hundreds of guns simultaneously in pre-planned barrages that could devastate entire sectors. But Russian artillery lacked flexibility. Once a barrage plan was set, it couldn't be adjusted quickly for changing tactical situations. Russian artillery was a hammer, tremendously powerful, but slow to redirect. American artillery at Elsenborn was different. It combined mass with responsiveness. Individual American batteries were no more powerful than German or Russian equivalents. The 105mm howitzer, the standard American divisional artillery piece, had similar range and shell weight to German equivalents. But American batteries could respond to calls for fire within minutes. They could shift targets rapidly. They could coordinate with other batteries for concentrated fires, and they could deliver time-on-target strikes that arrived without warning. German after-action reports from units that fought at Elsenborn repeatedly emphasized the speed and accuracy of American artillery. Commanders noted that American forward observers seemed to be everywhere, calling fire on any German movement. Assembly areas that should have been safe from observation drew accurate fire within minutes of troops gathering. Approach routes that German planners had identified as concealed from direct observation were still targeted precisely. Counter-battery fire against German artillery positions was swift and devastating. Part of this was superior American observation capabilities. American forward observers were well-trained, well-equipped with radios, and integrated directly into infantry units at company and battalion level. They could call for fire from any battery in range, not just batteries organic to their division. This meant a forward observer from the 99th Division could request support from 2nd Division artillery or 1st Division artillery or corps-level guns. The system treated all artillery as general support, rather than being rigidly allocated to specific units. But observation alone didn't explain the coordination speed. German intelligence officers interviewed prisoners and examined captured American positions, trying to understand how fire direction centers could calculate and deliver fire so quickly. They found standard American artillery pieces, standard ammunition, standard communications equipment, nothing obviously different. The fire direction center tents contained plotting boards, maps, radio equipment, field telephones, standard equipment. The captured documents showed standard procedures. What the Germans never discovered was the graphical firing table. The device was small, easily overlooked among other fire direction center equipment. Even if captured intact, it might not be recognized as significant. It looked like a ruler with markings. Only someone who understood American artillery doctrine and calculation methods would realize it was the key to American artillery superiority. German artillery doctrine still relied on pre-plotted concentrations. Before an offensive, German artillery officers would survey positions, calculate firing data for planned target areas, and prepare detailed fire plans. During the actual battle, batteries would execute these pre-prepared plans. This worked well for set-piece attacks, where the sequence of targets was predictable, but it was inflexible. If the tactical situation changed, if targets moved, if unexpected targets appeared, German artillery couldn't respond quickly. Fire direction centers had to recalculate using their tabular methods, which took minutes. By the time fire arrived, the target had changed. American artillery at Elsenborn operated completely differently. Forward observers identified targets in real time. Fire direction centers calculated new data for each mission using graphical firing tables. Batteries could shift from one target to another in under 2 minutes. The entire system emphasized flexibility and speed over detailed pre-planning. This matched the fluid nature of defensive operations where targets couldn't be predicted in advance. The psychological impact on German soldiers was severe. Traditional German infantry doctrine assumed that artillery preparation would precede attacks and that defending artillery would respond gradually allowing attackers time to close with defenders under covering fire from their own artillery. At Elsenborn, those assumptions failed. American artillery didn't wait for German artillery to suppress them. American guns fired first, accurately and devastatingly. German infantry advancing toward American positions were hit by concentrated fire before they could deploy effectively. German artillery trying to support attacks found their battery positions targeted within minutes of opening fire. One German regimental commander, who survived the battle, later wrote that his troops lost confidence in their ability to attack successfully. They had been told that surprise and superior numbers would overwhelm the Americans. Instead, they found themselves advancing into kill zones where every movement drew instant artillery response. Units took casualties before even making contact with American infantry. Soldiers who had fought across Europe without questioning German superiority began to question whether the war was winnable. This erosion of morale was as significant as the physical casualties. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend had been formed in 1943 from Hitler Youth members, fanatically motivated and exceptionally well-trained. They considered themselves elite troops. At Elsenborn, they broke against American defenses and suffered such heavy casualties that the division was combat ineffective by December 23rd. German commanders had to pull them out of the line. An elite SS Panzer Division, stopped cold by American artillery and infantry fighting from defensive positions. The failure at Elsenborn forced fundamental changes to the German offensive plan. The original concept required the 6th SS Panzer Army to make the main penetration in the north, seize the Meuse River crossings, and drive on Antwerp. The 5th Panzer Army in the centre would support by protecting the southern flank. But when the 6th SS Panzer Army stalled at Elsenborn, unable to secure the road network it needed, Hitler redirected effort to the 5th Panzer Army's sector. This meant attacking through more difficult terrain with fewer roads. It also meant the offensive lost cohesion. Instead of a concentrated thrust with clear objectives, German forces were spread across multiple axes without sufficient strength for decisive breakthrough anywhere. American artillery superiority wasn't limited to Elsenborn. Similar patterns appeared across the entire Bulge sector. At Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne Division and attached units were surrounded, American artillery played a crucial role in the defense. Forward observers with the paratroopers called fire from corps-level artillery batteries positioned outside the encirclement. These batteries, using graphical firing tables and time-on-target techniques, could deliver concentrated fire on German positions threatening Bastogne, even though they were miles away from the actual combat. The coordination was seamless. Observers in Bastogne called targets. Fire direction centers outside the perimeter calculated and coordinated fire. Shells arrived precisely where needed. In the southern sector of the Bulge, where George Patton's Third Army counterattacked to relieve Bastogne, American artillery again demonstrated superiority. Patton's advance required rapid displacement of artillery to keep up with moving infantry and armor. American artillery units could displace, occupy new positions, register targets, and be ready to fire in under 2 hours. German artillery, much of it still horse-drawn, took most of a day to displace equivalent distances. This mobility disparity meant American forces always had artillery support while German forces increasingly lacked it. By December 23rd, the German offensive at Elsenborn had failed completely. The 6th SS Panzer Army could not advance. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, one of the most elite units in the German military, was combat ineffective. Supporting Volksgrenadier divisions had been shattered. The road network the Germans needed was denied to them. Hitler finally accepted reality and redirected the 6th Panzer Army south to support the 5th Panzer Army's advance toward Bastogne. But Bastogne held. The entire German offensive, which had been predicated on rapid breakthrough and exploitation, bogged down. By early January 1945, the Bulge was being compressed from both sides. By the end of January, the Germans had been pushed back to their start lines, having achieved nothing except enormous casualties they could not afford. The Battle of the Bulge was the largest battle ever fought by the United States Army. Over 600,000 American troops participated. American casualties exceeded 83,000, including 19,000 killed. But the Germans lost 100,000 casualties, 600 tanks, and hundreds of aircraft. More importantly, they lost their last mobile reserves and their last chance to avoid total defeat. After the Bulge, Germany's defeat was inevitable. The northern shoulder at Elsenborn Ridge was crucial to that outcome. If the Germans had captured the ridge, the entire offensive might have succeeded. The road network would have been open. Liège would have been threatened. The Allied front might have been split. But Elsenborn held. And it held primarily because of American artillery. German commanders later analyzed the battle. Gerd von Rundstedt, who nominally commanded the offensive, wrote that the Germans failed because the northern shoulder was impenetrable. Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army, wrote that the German offensive failed because the right flank near Monschau ran into a wall. That wall was artillery. Concentrated, coordinated, responsive artillery that could deliver devastating firepower faster than German forces could react. The technical innovation that made this possible was the graphical firing table developed by Burns and Kaiser at Fort Sill. The tactical innovation was time-on-target fire coordination. Together, these innovations gave American artillery a decisive advantage. German forces could not counter it because they could not see it. The graphical firing table was a small wooden device hidden in fire direction center tents. The time-on-target technique was just a coordination method. Nothing visible on the battlefield revealed why American artillery was suddenly so much more effective. German intelligence tried to determine what had changed. They examined captured American positions. They interrogated prisoners. They analyzed tactics. But they found nothing obvious. American guns were the same models they had faced for months. American ammunition was the same. Radio equipment was standard. The Germans never discovered that the change was a 10-inch wooden slide rule that let fire direction centers calculate data 20 times faster than traditional methods. That calculation speed enabled time-on-target fires. And time-on-target fires changed the nature of artillery warfare. For the first time, artillery could deliver all its firepower in a single devastating instant instead of spread out over minutes. The psychological effect on German soldiers was enormous. Traditional doctrine for surviving artillery was to take cover after the first rounds landed. But at Elsenborn, there were no first rounds. All rounds landed together. Soldiers who survived described the experience as being hit by a wall of explosions with no warning. The effect cascaded through German operations. Assembly areas became death traps. Approach routes were interdicted before German forces could deploy. Counterattacks were broken up before they started. German commanders lost the ability to mass forces for offensive operations because any concentration immediately drew coordinated artillery fire. The initiative shifted completely to the Americans. American infantry who fought at Elsenborn credited artillery with their survival. The 2nd Infantry Division was outnumbered and outgunned by German armor, but they had artillery support that arrived within minutes of being called, that landed exactly where it was needed, that could be concentrated from multiple divisions to crush any German attack. One infantry company commander said he felt like he had the entire United States Army's firepower available whenever he needed it. That was not an exaggeration. Heinz had created a system where any forward observer could call for fire and receive support from any battery in range. It didn't matter which division the battery belonged to. If a forward observer from the 99th Division called for fire, batteries from the 2nd Division could respond. If the 1st Division needed support, 9th Division artillery could provide it. All coordinated through Heinz command post. All calculated using graphical firing tables. All delivered as time-on-target strikes when appropriate. This level of coordination was unprecedented. British artillery used similar techniques but couldn't match American speed and flexibility. German artillery was still largely horse-drawn, couldn't keep up with mobile operations, and lacked the communication networks for rapid coordination. Russian artillery had massive firepower, but relied on pre-planned barrages, not responsive fire support. American artillery at Elsenborn set a new standard for what concentrated firepower could achieve. The irony was that the technology enabling this revolution was so simple. A wooden slide rule, printed scales, a plastic cursor. Any machinist could manufacture it. The Fort Sill bookstore sold them for $1.50 after the war, but the impact was enormous. That simple device enabled calculation speeds that made time on target practical. And time on target gave American artillery overwhelming superiority at Elsenborn Ridge. Abbott Harrington Burns never received official recognition for developing the graphical firing table. Army documentation attributed it to institutional development at the Field Artillery School. Burns's name didn't appear in official records. After the war, he left the Army and returned to Arizona, where he eventually took that construction job with the telephone company he'd been planning in 1940. He worked quietly, never seeking attention, never talking much about his contribution to artillery tactics. George Kaiser received a mention in internal Army memos but no public recognition. He continued his Army career, eventually commanding the 74th Field Artillery and reaching the rank of Brigadier General. He stayed in touch with Burns after the war and occasionally mentioned the graphical firing table in conversations with other artillery officers, but the story never gained wide attention. John Hamilton Hines continued commanding artillery through the end of the war. After Germany surrendered, he served in occupation duties and then returned to the United States. He commanded artillery in the Korean War and eventually retired as a major general in the 1950s. He died in 1993 at age 95. His obituaries mentioned his distinguished service but didn't emphasize his role at Elsenborn Ridge. The artillery coordination he pioneered at Elsenborn became standard doctrine, but his name wasn't prominently associated with it in public memory. The Battle of Elsenborn Ridge itself faded somewhat from popular consciousness. When Americans think about the Battle of the Bulge, they remember Bastogne and the 101st Airborne. The siege of Bastogne makes for dramatic storytelling. Surrounded paratroopers, McAuliffe's famous reply of nuts to German surrender demands, Patton's Third Army racing north to relieve the siege. These are compelling narratives that capture public imagination. Elsenborn Ridge was different. No dramatic siege, no famous quotations, just a methodical defensive battle where artillery and infantry cooperation stopped the main German thrust before it could develop. The outcome was more decisive than Bastogne. If Bastogne had fallen, the German offensive would have been slowed but not stopped. If Elsenborn had fallen, the German offensive might have succeeded. But Elsenborn's story is less dramatic. Brigadier generals coordinating fire missions, batteries calculating data with slide rules, forward observers calling corrections. These don't make for Hollywood narratives. Yet Elsenborn Ridge demonstrated something fundamental about modern warfare. Firepower, properly coordinated, defeats mass. The Germans had numerical superiority, better tanks, elite SS units, and the advantage, too, of surprise. The Americans had artillery coordination enabled by a wooden slide rule. Artillery won. Not through overwhelming numbers, not through superior technology, through superior coordination made possible by a simple calculation device that eliminated time delays. This pattern repeated throughout the rest of the war. American artillery consistently outperformed German artillery, despite often being outnumbered. The reason was coordination speed. Graphical firing tables and time-on-target tactics gave American artillery a response time Germans couldn't match. By the time German forces identified American positions and calculated counter-battery fire, American batteries had displaced. By the time German infantry assembled for attacks, American artillery had already ranged their assembly areas. The calculation speed advantage translated into tactical superiority across every engagement. In the Pacific Theater, the same pattern emerged. American artillery supporting island assaults used graphical firing tables and time-on-target tactics to devastating effect. Japanese forces, which relied heavily on night attacks and infiltration, found that American artillery could respond faster than they could exploit surprise. Forward observers called fire missions. Fire direction centers calculated data in seconds. Batteries delivered time on target strikes that caught Japanese forces in the open. The speed of response negated Japanese tactical advantages. After World War II, the graphical firing table remained standard equipment in American artillery until computers made manual calculation obsolete in the 1970s and 80s. Artillery officers who trained at Fort Sill in the 1950s and 60s learned to use the device as part of basic fire direction training. It was considered essential knowledge for any competent artillery officer. The technique became so ingrained in American artillery doctrine that younger officers often didn't realize it had ever been different. The principle behind the graphical firing table, that reducing calculation time enables better tactics, became foundational to military thinking about technology. Every subsequent innovation in fire control was evaluated based on whether it could reduce the time between identifying a target and delivering fire. Digital computers, automated fire direction systems, GPS-guided munitions, all built on the same principle. Faster calculation enables faster response. Faster response creates tactical advantage. But the origin of that principle was a captain in November 1940 who hated horses and spent an evening making a paper slide rule to avoid tedious mathematics. Burns wasn't trying to revolutionize warfare. He was trying to make his job less annoying. The fact that his solution changed how artillery operated for the next 40 years was almost accidental. He saw an inefficiency, created a simple tool to eliminate it, and moved on. The tool happened to enable tactical innovations that gave American artillery decisive advantages in every theater of World War II. That's how real innovation often works. Not through grand strategic planning or massive research programs, but through practical people solving immediate problems with simple solutions. The graphical firing table wasn't developed because the Army identified a need for faster calculation methods. It was developed because one officer was frustrated with slow calculations and spent an evening making something better. The fact that something better turned out to be strategically decisive was a consequence, not an intent. Burns died in 1994 at age 82. His obituary in the Arizona Republic mentioned his military service but didn't mention the graphical firing table. Most people who knew him in Arizona had no idea he had invented anything significant. He ran his small contracting business, worked on construction projects, and lived quietly. In 1983, a military historian researching field artillery school history found references to Burns and Kaiser in Fort Sill archives and tracked Burns down for an interview. Burns confirmed he had developed the graphical firing table, said it wasn't anything complicated, just a slide rule for artillery calculations. The historian estimated the device may have contributed to several hundred American lives saved through improved artillery effectiveness. Burns said he'd never thought about it that way. He'd just been trying to make calculations faster. The graphical firing table is now a museum piece. The Smithsonian Institution has several examples in their military history collections. Fort Sill's Field Artillery Museum displays one with a placard explaining its use. Artillery history texts mention it briefly when discussing World War II fire direction techniques. But it's not widely known outside military history circles. Most Americans who learn about the Battle of the Bulge never hear about it. The focus stays on Bastogne, on Patton's relief column, on the heroic defense by surrounded paratroopers, Elsenborn Ridge, where the German offensive actually failed, where the main German thrust was stopped, where American artillery demonstrated capabilities that changed warfare, remains less famous. The 348 guns that Heinz coordinated, the time-on-target strikes that devastated German attacks, the graphical firing tables that made it all possible. These are footnotes in most histories, yet Elsenborn mattered more than Bastogne. The northern shoulder held. The 6th SS Panzer Army never broke through. The road networks stayed in American hands. Liège was never threatened. First Army headquarters remained secure. The Allied front didn't split, all because artillery, coordinated faster and more effectively than ever before in military history, made German offensive operations impossible. That coordination depended on a wooden slide rule, invented in an evening by an officer who just wanted calculations to take less time. That's the reality of how wars are won. Not through dramatic last stands or heroic charges, but through technical improvements that let ordinary soldiers do their jobs slightly better. A few seconds saved in calculation time, multiplied across hundreds of batteries, translated into thousands of shells arriving simultaneously instead of sequentially, resulting in German attacks shattered before they could develop, leading to the northern shoulder holding, enabling the eventual Allied victory. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one shaped the outcome of the war, and we'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.